So this is an interesting one. I was in Shanghai a couple weeks ago, and although when you're watching this, it might be a couple of months ago. So that's the magic of time shifting. And I was talking to a good friend of mine, Deirdre, who works for one of the agencies in Shanghai, and she started talking about this idea of assets versus access. Don't say that when you've had a few drinks or too fast, like a tongue twister. Assets versus access. And I started like building some thinking around it. If you think about it, the way the world used to work is that marketers and brands had no way of being able to connect directly with their consumers. No way. I mean, other than promotions where you sent in a self-addressed stamped envelope, there was really no way of being able to connect on an ongoing basis. This is pre-Google and pre the web and pre-social media. And the only way that they could, in fact, get through or break through the clutter, if you will, was by going through middlemen. And those middlemen were media companies, were networks, where they had to buy time on these networks in order to get in front of their consumers. Well, obviously, that has changed. One of the biggest trends that I've spoken about for years is this concept of, we get it in the pharmaceutical DTC space, direct to consumer. And this idea of being able to go direct to our consumers or your consumers is probably you could probably count it on one hand, even on three fingers, one of the most important things that you can ever do, building these direct connections with your consumer, because you don't necessarily need to go through middlemen anymore. Your website, your social hub, your branded community, however you think about it, even customer service through Twitter in a social media enabled world, you can go direct to your consumer and your consumer can go directly to you. You've never really been in the asset business. The asset was the content that the networks provided, and you got to sponsor those assets. When brands have tried to be content creators, they've failed because that asset that they bring to the table is not, in fact, content. But what they have and what you have is access to assets. You have sponsorships. You have endorsements. You have spokespeople. You have access to tickets from events that you sponsor. When you can give your consumers access not only to other assets that you've sponsored or bought or loaned over time, but also access to the brand, access to the people behind the brand, access to the developers and the engineers, that is a different kind of direct-to-consumer relationship. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not a one thing or the other. But if you take away anything from this particular episode of Jaffe Juice TV, it's to understand the difference between an asset and access. Recognize you can, in fact, do both. But ultimately, you're going to excel by doing two things. One is building relationships, direct relationships with your consumers, creating direct-to-consumer channels that go out and that come in. That's number one. And number two is understanding the difference between the asset and the access. Where you excel and where you always have is access. Figure out what that access looks like, promote it, enhance it, celebrate it, showcase it, and then activate it. And those represent a pretty powerful 1-2 punch, in my humble opinion. Jaffe@power.com, @JaffeJuice on Twitter. It's time to flip the funnel now. Pick up a copy of my new book, available wherever books are sold.